Hello, and welcome to another episode of this Robin Hood Moment. My name is Kevin Thompson, and I'm the Managing Director of Communications at Robin Hood, New York City's largest local poverty-fighting philanthropy. And during today's episode of this Robin Hood Moment, Richard Buery Jr., Robin Hood's CEO, joins us in discussion about racial equity and racial justice. We'll explore what it is, how and why these concepts have become central to the fight against poverty, and how advancing racial equity and justice will make the future of New York City stronger and more competitive than ever before. Rich, we're so honored to have you here on the show today, and welcome.
Thanks, Kevin. I appreciate it.
You know, before we get into our conversation, Rich, around what Robin Hood is doing around racial equity, help our listeners think a little bit about what these concepts of racial equity and racial justice actually mean and why they've become so controversial in our public discourse.
Sure. I can certainly give you my 2 cents. I think it's important when talking about racial equity and racial justice to both describe what I think those words mean, but also what they don't mean. So what does it mean to me? I think the basic definition of racial equity is really to say that we want to overcome racial-based disparities and outcomes among people in America and to dismantle the system and the structures that create and sustain those disparities. It is impossible to really think about those disparities without understanding history. So, you think about it, from the time that the first Europeans, made their way to the Western Hemisphere, and certainly from the time that the first Africans were brought here against their will, race has played a central and defining role in the experiences of all the people who lived here. And that starts with the theft of Black labor and property and identity, the racial oppression, the dismantling of families. And go through past history, the history of segregation, of systemic disinvestment, and everything from education to housing, lack of access to capital, lack of access to jobs, to the present, where we still find studies that show that Black homeowners get less value for their homes than white homeowners. So these things build up to create our current present. And even systems that seem on their face to be neutral, just the way systems operate, when they're built on a structure that has kept some people away from the education, the access to capital, the things that build opportunity and wealth in our society, you can't disentangle race from the way those systems operate. So for me, racial equity is about overcoming those race-based disparities and doing it by dismantling the systems that propagate those things both in the past and in the present. Racial equity isn't colorblindness. Racial equity isn't ignoring those facts that we know are true. If it's raining outside, you can decide to go out without an umbrella. You can decide to ignore the weather, but you're still going to get wet. And that's what racial equity is not. There's a famous Chief Justice Roberts, in an earlier Supreme Court decision when he was in the minority, a decision which upheld affirmative action before the court overturned it this year, had this famous quote. I'm going to butcher it, but the point of the quote was, the best way to stop discriminating on the basis of race is to stop discriminating on the basis of race. In other words, the idea that if you want to end discrimination, stop making distinctions on the basis of race, which is a very compelling idea on the surface. But the problem is it just doesn't make any sense.
Yes, but Rich, it sounds like you are questioning the logic of the justices here. It sounds like you might think it's a little flawed. Help us understand why that might be flawed logic, and maybe by just beginning with, what does it mean to discriminate?
First of all, you have to unpack the word discrimination. Because we in everyday discourse, I think of racial discrimination, we put a lot of weight on those words. But really all discrimination means is to discriminate, to make decisions based on distinctions, right? So it's discrimination to say that only 4 and 5-year-olds go to kindergarten. We don't send 4-year-olds to kindergarten. That's discriminating. You're treating people differently because they're differently situated. Not to get too personal, but I made an appointment for my first colonoscopy today because I'm above 40, older than 45. And no, they don't do that for 20-year-olds.
Right.
So the issue is that you can't solve a problem without tackling the roots of the problem. The constitutional provisions that the court, and again, we're not talking about affirmative action, but it's hard to not talk about it in this context. The Supreme Court, which overturned affirmative action at Harvard, North Carolina, and the recent decision SFFA versus Harvard, based that decision on the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution, the 14th Amendment, which guaranteed everybody the equal protection of the laws. And Justice Roberts and others have interpreted that, the Supreme Court's jurisprudence have interpreted that to mean colorblindness, that colorblindness is the ideal, that not discriminating, lowercase d, not treating people, difference of race is the norm, not taking account of race is the norm. But that's not what the 14th Amendment was about. The 14th Amendment wasn't about ending discrimination. It was about ending discrimination as a tool of racial oppression. The 14th Amendment was adopted to protect the former slaves and to advance their citizenship. That same court adopted what could only be described as the first affirmative action laws, things like the Freedmen Bureau, which was designed to provide material and direct assistance, not to everyone, but to those who needed it, the former slaves. So what racial equity means to me is advancing a world where our outcomes in life are not determined by the color of our skin. But to do that, you have to take account of where people are and why they are there. You cannot create a solution without addressing the problem. What racial justice is not is pretending that we are equal and assuming that means equality.
That historical context is really helpful. Maybe that can bridge us into a little bit of a discussion on how Robin Hood, if you could talk a little bit about either the research or the evidence that we use to sort of center equity in our fight against poverty.
Yeah, it's pretty straightforward. So I think there are a couple dimensions to it. Well, one is we have a pretty straightforward mission and a pretty straightforward ethos to how to achieve the mission. The mission is we want to fight poverty in New York. We want to do that by creating equal opportunity for all. Right? So we want to fight poverty in New York. And the ethos behind that is that we use data. None of us want to do all this work, spend all this money, and feel good that we tried. We want to know that the money that we invest is going towards strategies that actually move the needle. If we give $1 to a school, that school's going to do a better job of getting those kids educated and into bright futures than would have happened if we didn't give the $1. We want to make sure that public policies, that we're embracing and advocating for public policies that work. That's all data-driven. So the why racial equity is data. Mm-hmm. The data says that by any measure that we can imagine, people of color, and that would be clear, we often talk about this as Black Americans, Latino Americans, also talking about Native Americans, we're talking about Asian Americans, which is experiencing the fastest growth in poverty in New York, that by any measure, people of color, and particularly Black Latino people, are doing worse by standards of outcomes, wealth, educational attainment, criminal justice involvement, you pick it. And as I started by saying, that's not an accident. It's not a measure of inferiority of Black people or people with more melanin in their skin. It's because of systems that create those outcomes. I always say that you look at the data about racial outcomes in America, you got to believe one of two things. You got to believe something's wrong with Black people, that just Black people just aren't as smart, they don't work as hard, there's something broken in us. Or you got to believe there's something wrong with the country, that the country is continuously setting us up, creating systems where we are not able to live up to our potential. But you got to believe one of those two things. I don't really think there's a third lane here.
Yeah.
We believe the second. We think that's what the data showed us. As I said before, you can't really address a solution without understanding the root cause of the problem. We are race conscious because we believe that race is a significant driver of poverty. The data show that. The history explains it. And when I say history, I don't only mean the recent past. I mean the current experience of people in systems today. And then, part of it is also a theory of change about how things work. So we believe that oftentimes, we believe in innovation here. We want to try new things. We want to invest in what works. We want to build new models to see what works. And one of the things that we know that oftentimes in our society, the best solutions can come from the people who are closest to the problem. There's evidence that backs that up, but it's also common sense, right? People who live through a thing often understand the thing best. And that means that as an institution, we should be on the lookout for leaders who have experience with problems who are close to community. For what we found in our philanthropy, and what this is not a Robin Hood problem, it's a philanthropy problem, is that philanthropic dollars don't go to all organizations equally. Equity and Green did some research that, as you know, this inspired our work here, that I believe the number was that 10% of philanthropic dollars going to organizations led by people of color. We saw in our own philanthropy that in a city that is primarily Black, Brown, and Asian, only 30% of the organizations we fund were led by people of color. And even though the organizations were actually getting less money, they're only getting 20% of our dollars. So what that means to us is that we should, if we're going to be data-driven and self-critical, we should look at that data. It's unlikely that that means that people of color are less likely to lead strong organizations. What it may mean is that, as with most institutions, our awareness is limited by our networks, that we just didn't know some of the grassroots organizations, and that some of the grassroots organizations might have strong people and strong talent, but may not have the resources to know how to get to a place like Robin Hood or how to talk to us. Because frankly, we can be a lot of work. Because we are, and not for malicious reasons, but because we really want to rigorously understand the impact of what we're investing in. So all these things came together to cause us to be more race conscious in our work. Race conscious in the sense that we want to make sure that we are affirmatively identifying talents in the nonprofit sector out in the world, with the hope that by doing so, we have a greater pool of organizations to look at and are more likely to find the ones that are having an impact. And I think that's been borne out by experience. We started an initiative called the Power Fund a few years ago under my predecessor, Wes Moore, who I hear is doing big things in Maryland now.
So we're told.
Really a visionary effort, where we intentionally went out and said, let us do the work, that the burden is on, like I said before, the problem with Black people with the country. Think of the same thing for us. The problem is with Black nonprofit leaders, or the problem with Robin Hood. And we said, well, maybe the problem with Robin Hood. So we went out and did an intentional work of identifying leaders who are not part of our network, almost 24 so far. We provided significant grants, an average of $450,000, professional development for the leaders. And what we're finding in those groups is that those groups, again, is an organization, Robin Hood, that is extremely, did a lot of work to evaluate the impact of grants and doesn't renew grants where we find those investments were not having impact. The organizations in that Power Fund are actually being renewed at a higher rate than the organizations who are not in the Power Fund, which says to me that in this case, being race conscious makes a positive difference. So that's why we think about race. We think about race because we want to fight poverty. And you can't fight poverty without thinking about race.
You talked about some of these lessons from the Power Fund. How are you going to integrate any of that moving forward with the grant making we do here at Robin Hood?
Well, I think that the trick is, well, I shouldn't say the trick, the discipline is, the approach that we took to identify institutions through the Power Fund should not be an ancillary to our practice. It shouldn't be next to our practice. It should be our practice. So fundamentally, what we've done, the way we organize our grant making is fundamentally through life stage window. We have an early childhood team, a team that focuses on school age children, a team that focuses on adults and household supports, and a team that focuses on young adults. We have other programs too, but we essentially organize by life stages, rather than having a separate mechanism that is going out and finding organizations led by people of color. We are bringing that discipline to those individual teams and holding those teams accountable for doing that work. So we'll continue to provide the support that we have, but we're holding each of those teams accountable for doing the work by using the lessons of the Power Fund, including expanded networks. We're excited about the future. We want to hold ourselves accountable. We're making progress. As I mentioned, 30% of our grants used to go to organizations led by people of color. Now almost half do, 48%. We can't take all the credit for that. Part of that is a world in the city which is doing a better job of elevating leaders of color into the very difficult role of being a nonprofit executive director or CEO. So some of that is a natural transformation of the organization that we already support. But some of that is the hard work that our team is doing about pushing outside of our comfort zones. And it's meant that we're actually going into parts of the city that we just haven't supported before in significantly. Places like Red Hook, where we haven't had a lot of grants, which is an area of deep need in Northwest Brooklyn. And so this work is driving us forward in that way. And I would also say that it's also driving us to think about the Asian American community, because the other thing that we, I think, have done at Robin Hood, but again, it's not only Robin Hood, is that when we've talked about poverty, and talked about race and poverty, and I do it too. I think I catch myself doing it in my own language. We immediately go to Blacks and Latinos without recognizing the diversity and the great and growing need in the Asian American community. One of the ways in which racism has manifested itself in America is, which is the model minority myth, which posits that Asians are okay, they're smarter and better, and therefore, you might think that's a positive story, but what it translates into is that they don't need support. They don't need help. If anything, we have to hold them at bay because they're doing so well. Again, we as an institution have been more conscious about, are we providing support to leaders of Asian American descent in our nonprofit sectors? Are we supporting organizations that support Asian American communities in poverty to the extent that we do Black and Latino? And the answer is no and no. So we have a lot more work to do. So that's the context. But to go to your question about racial equity, it really is about a reflection of history. But the one thing that we also know about New York City is, people are always counting New York City out. And it's happening obviously during the pandemic as well. But somehow New York City is going to collapse. I don't believe New York City is going to collapse. We got challenges, but we're not going to collapse. One reason why I believe that is because this is not the first crisis we faced. Hurricane Sandy, 9/11, and the city keeps coming back. Sometimes the easy way, sometimes the hard way, but the city keeps coming back. I think fundamentally because the city has a set of assets that if we continue to support and invest in, just make this a place where people want to come because other people are here. Talent, physical beauty, industry, education. So people come here, arts and culture, people come here. So I don't really have we have to make smart choices. But if we make the smart choices, we know how to do this. I would say with one asterisk. The experience of people in the city, and the reason why often people who live in poverty, people who may live in the outer boroughs don't trust efforts like this, is because those recoveries, when they come, often create incredible wealth. You think about how the city recovered after 9/11. Incredible wealth, incredible opportunity. These things happen, but what people experience is that it doesn't feel like it happens for everybody. The economy craters, the city comes back. When it comes back, the richer get richer and the poor get poorer. And people of color get left behind. But it doesn't have to be that way. We're going to build a roadmap to recovery, but it's got to look different than the way people have experienced recoveries before. It's got to be a recovery that everyone benefits from. My favorite overused quote, the cliche, but like a lot of cliches, it's a cliche because people keep saying it because it makes a lot of sense, is, America gets a cold, Black people catch pneumonia. It's the idea that when the country is going through challenges, people of color bear a heavier burden. We saw that during the pandemic. We saw that mortality rates worse in communities of color, more likely to have family members or yourself be a frontline worker and to be exposed to the virus. Unemployment rates higher for people of color, remaining so even as the job sector has come back, even as employers are desperate for work. Unemployment rate for Black New Yorkers is 3 times the rate of white New Yorkers still. So what we the roadmap we set for ourselves is that we wanted a recovery that was equitable, that everyone could benefit from. And my mantra for that is this great quote from Arundhati Roy, who I'm sure, at some point I have to learn how to pronounce her name, I'm sure I'm butchering it, but the Indian author who wrote this really incredible essay about the experience of India during the pandemic. I can't remember if it's Forbes or Fortune, but you can find it online. I encourage anyone who's listening to read it. It's short, but it's beautiful. She ended this incredible phrase, which I'm not gonna try to quote because I don't know it by heart. But essentially, what she says: we have the opportunity with the pandemic to drag our prejudices, our inequities through that portal with us, basically to bring all of us into the path with us, or we can treat that pandemic as a doorway, an opportunity to build something new, to build a future that works for everyone. And I find it to be such a beautiful vision that we have to look at this crisis as an opportunity to do better as we think about how to rebuild the structure of education and the economy and the housing market. And so that was really the idea that drove so much of our work, and which I hope continues to drive how we measure our success.
That's beautiful and so hopeful for New York City, and really important in a place where 80% of the people living in poverty are people of color. Rich, thank you for your time, for your leadership here at Robin Hood, and your commitment to the future of New York City. Please come back and join us again. We love it when the boss shows up to chat with us a little bit. That was Richard Buery Jr., CEO of Robin Hood, and I'm Kevin Thompson. Until next time, thank you for tuning in today. For more information and news about Robin Hood and our impact, visit us at robinhood.org.